With free agency right around the corner, it's time to preview which defensive players should be targets for the Buffalo Bills today on Locked On Bills.
You are Locked On Bills, your daily Buffalo Bills podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bills Mafia? It's Joe Marino from the Draft Network, and I'm your host of Locked On Bills. Happy Thursday to you, and thank you for making Locked On Bills your first listen every day, or if you're joining us on YouTube, your first watch every day. Today on the podcast, we are going to focus on the defensive players at each position that I think the Buffalo Bills should target in free agency, just like we did yesterday with the offensive side of the football. Before we get there, I do want to talk quickly about the Bills' decision to release linebacker A.J. Klein. And this is a move that I think we all expected. It freed up just a tick over $5 million in cap space. And while we can all appreciate A.J. Klein as a football player and what he's meant to the depth of the linebacker core over the last two seasons, being able to create $5 million in cap space was absolutely necessary for the Bills to become cap compliant. I'm also fairly high on the Bills' depth at linebacker with Tyrell Dodson, Andre Smith, and Joe Giles-Harris. I think that between those three players, you can have the linebacker that you want to have on the field when you go with three linebackers, or your versatile backup to both Edmunds and Milano. I think you can capture all of those things within Dodson, Smith, and Giles-Harris. And so this was a no-brainer decision. And Klein had a good 2-year stretch with the Bills, but unfortunately the money just does not make sense for him to continue on the team in 2022. So like I said, we're talking defensive free agent targets for the Buffalo Bills. I have 5 options for you to be made aware of at defensive end, defensive tackle, linebacker, cornerback, safety, and then we'll talk about a few punters here at the end of the podcast. And just like yesterday, I'm going to give you a big fish at every position. You know, if the Bills were to go with a splashy guy, this would be the target that I would recommend. And then some other options that I think are more bargain bin, predictive, personal preference type options. So let's start with defensive end. My big fish at defensive end would be Chandler Jones from the Arizona Cardinals. He's 32 years old, and he would be probably pretty expensive. Pro Football Focus estimates that he'll sign a 2-year, $33.5 million contract. I think Chandler Jones would be an awesome addition to the football team. Now, the money side of things, Brandon Beane's got to figure that out. But if they were going to go after a big fish free agency, a big fish free agent on either side of the football, I'll be completely honest with you, I would want it to be Chandler Jones. When you're talking about this defensive end room consisting of Greg Rousseau entering his second season, Boogie Basham entering his second season with a fairly small sample size of playing time under his belt, and A.J. Epinesa entering his third season, and he hasn't really commanded much playing time. And that being your top 3 defensive ends, I think the Buffalo Bills need to have a plan to add a veteran to this mix. Now, if you want to make the big swing, go get Chandler Jones. Now, you can make a case to bring back Jerry Hughes at a fraction of what you're going to pay Chandler Jones, or consider some of the options that I'm about to talk about. But to me, that guy that can come in and really be a difference maker at defensive end for the Buffalo Bills, it's Chandler Jones. And he would move the needle a lot for me, personally. I think he is still, at 32 years old, an impact defensive end. In fact, I did an article a couple of years on Chandler Jones, and his sack pace was actually ahead of Bruce Smith. Now, obviously, Bruce Smith being able to continue to rack up sacks into his mid to late 30s is what really allowed him to get to 200. But Chandler Jones was pacing ahead of him not too long ago. Now, obviously, he had an injury back in 2020, which set off that pace a little bit, but he picked things back up last year, and I still think there's a lot of good football left in the tank for Chandler Jones. Now, the more bargain bin guys, the first name I'll mention is Whitney Merciless, former first-round pick of the Texans back in 2012, and he actually signed an extension with them late in the season. In December 2019, he signed a 4-year, $53.5 million deal in December 2019, and then in October 21, he was released. He only played 19 games under that new extension. Then he went to the Green Bay Packers, signed a 1-year, $1.1 million contract, and then just a couple days, that was just a couple days after he was cut by the Texans, and then not long after he went to Green Bay, he suffered a season-ending injury after just 4 games. So he's 31 years old, and he's not far removed from delivering high-impact seasons in Houston where he earned that contract extension. And so I think for a veteran in the room to go with these young players and a guy that I still think can produce, Whitney Merciless is a guy that really intrigues me. The next one is also a veteran, Justin Houston. He's entering his age 33 season, and he's been a productive player. And I really go back to his time with the Colts to look at a system that's more similar to what the Bills do, and he was a productive player in Indianapolis. And I don't think you're getting Justin Houston of 6-7 years ago, but I still think that he has the ability to impact the opposing quarterback. And the good thing about pass rushers is they tend to age pretty well as they become more nuanced with technique and softening rush angles and taking good angles and just overall anticipation and vision to read the pocket. These pass rushers tend to age well. And that's why I don't really hesitate about Chandler Jones at 32 or Whitney Merciless at 31 or Justin Houston at 33, especially in a rotation-heavy defense that the Bills run with 3 young guys that can be there to really eat up a lot of the snaps. You can use these veterans on long and late downs, have them fresh for when it really matters. So Jones, Merciless, and Houston are the 3 veteran, really established players. And then I have a couple of guys that are in their late 20s that I'm also interested in. We'll start with Dante Fowler. He's entering his age 28 season. He had two seasons with Atlanta where I thought he was just okay and really didn't make the impact that you would expect. But previously in his career, whether it was with the Rams or even late with Jacksonville, he found production rushing the passer. And so I think as a veteran in the room that still has some value getting after the quarterback, Dante Fowler is intriguing to me. And the last player that I'll mention, and this is probably a deeper bargain bin guy, it's Stephen Weatherly, who was entering his age 28 season. And there's been a few years now where we've been kind of waiting for him to break out, where there's been a lot of really good flashes, whether that was with Minnesota or when he went to Carolina. He's a player that has a lot of ability, but never really has been able to find consistency, but there's a lot of talent there. And so I think he'd be an interesting bottom of the rotation type guy to add to the mix that I think has some untapped potential, and maybe Buffalo's the spot that could unlock that. So at defensive end, I have Chandler Jones as the big fish, Whitney Merciless, Justin Houston, Dante Fowler, and Stephen Weatherly. And of course, the Bills could just opt to look at Mario Addison or Jerry Hughes to come back into the mix and have their veteran in the room. Football might be over for this season, but basketball is in full steam for both pro and college hoops. From all the latest odds, totals, player performance props to where the next fired coach is going to land, BetOnline.net is the #1 spot for all of your sports betting needs. BetOnline remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline.net is your source for hockey, boxing, and UFC. They've even got Vegas casino games. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action, because BetOnline is where the game starts. All right, let's talk about defensive tackles. This is the position that I have identified as the most important for the Bills to address this offseason. Obviously, Ed Oliver, Starlo Tulele, your only 2 players under contract right now at defensive tackle, not to mention Eli Onquo, who is, kind of a practice squad player. But if they went after a big fish at defensive tackle, B.J. Hill from the Cincinnati Bengals is the player I would be most interested in. He's entering his age 26 season. Pro Football Focus estimates a 3-year, $26 million deal for B.J. Hill, and he is perfect for the Bills' one-tech needs. He's a really good, stout, physical run defender, and he has some pass rush ability as well. And whether it was with the Giants or Cincinnati, he's been a productive player to this point in his career. And I'm not sure if Cincinnati's going to let him get away, but if they do, and the Bills wanted to make a splash at defensive tackle, B.J. Hill is a player that I am quite fond of. Now for your bargain bin type players, the next one I'll mention is Daequan Jones. He's entering his age 30 season, and he had a really good run with the Tennessee Titans as a nose tackle, and then he went to Carolina last year and had a good season as well. For all the problems that the Carolina Panthers have, defense really isn't one of those issues. And he continued to showcase his ability to defend the run, has some pass rush ability, maybe a little more than what you get from Starlo Talele, but as a run stuffer that has some pass rush ability, that's a veteran that can come in and anchor the middle of the defense, keep the second level clean, I think you'd be well satisfied with a guy like Daequan Jones. The next name, Folly Farakasi, 27 years old, has been on the New York Jets, and he wasn't nearly as good this year as he was the previous 2 seasons, and I think you can look at the overall makeup of that Jets defense and understand exactly why. That team, just from a talent perspective overall, is lacking. And, you know, when you're talking about defense being a bunch of guys doing their 111th, it's going to be hard for individuals to stand out. But Folly Farakasi is a player that's interesting to me. He's big, he's athletic, he plays with a lot of energy, and I think he just embodies a lot of what the Bills would be looking for in a one-technique defensive tackle that specializes in defending the run, but has some pass rush ability as well. That won't be his calling card, but he's not completely incapable of rushing the passer. So Folly Farakasi from the New York Jets is a player that interests me quite a bit. Here's a guy that is a bit of a reclamation project that I want to introduce next, and that's Tave Bryant from the Jacksonville Jaguars. Was a first-round pick of theirs not too long ago, and he's not really developed into a consistent player, but he's had flashes. And Tave Bryant is extremely athletic. He's a high-motor player, and you know, there's a reason he was a first-round pick. And I think you can apply a lot of the logic that I said about Folly Farakasi to Tave Bryant and understand that Jacksonville, whether it was coaching or talent around him, wasn't the spot that was really going to unlock his potential. And, you know, perhaps there's some upward mobility remaining with him that you bring him in as the backup to Ed Oliver at 3 technique, and you feel like you've got a dynamic option in terms of athleticism that maybe you could coach up and get the impact Jacksonville thought they were going to get when they picked him in the first round. So he's kind of that bargain bin swing that I get really interested in at defensive tackle for the Bills. And the last name that I'll mention is Geron Reid, from the Kansas City Chiefs. He's 29 years old, was previously with Seattle before he went to Kansas City. And I think he's a dream one technique where he's stout against the run. He's a good pass rusher. He's probably a little bit pricey just based on the resume that he has so far in the NFL, but he's a guy that interests me. And if I'm not mistaken, the Bills had some level of interest when he was made available and he signed with the Kansas City Chiefs. And so that wouldn't surprise me if he was a real target for the Bills. Now, I said that Geron Reid would be the last name that I mentioned, but I got to be honest with you, I could have kept going here. I think the good news for the Bills and their need at defensive tackle is that between free agency and the draft, it is brimming with options. I very easily could have said DJ Jones, Linval Joseph, Tim Settle, Derek Nottie, Sebastian Joseph Day, Zach Kerr. All of these guys would be really good fits for the Bills at defensive tackle. A lot of them one techniques, but a few you could see playing the 3 and backing up Ed Oliver as well. And obviously, I really like a lot of the options in the draft. So while this is a big need for the Bills entering free agency, I think there's a lot of good solutions to be had. Let's talk linebackers. And the thing about linebackers, as we consider free agent options for the Bills, is that I'm not sure the Bills are really going to be aggressive at linebacker. I think between Tremaine Edmunds and Matt Milano, they view them as their obvious top two guys. And we've already kind of talked about the depth here with Tyrell Dotson and Andre Smith and Joe Giles-Harris, not to mention Tyler Medikevich, as players that are already in the mix here. And so I really don't have an expectation for the Bills to do much here at linebacker. But obviously, I want to give you 5 names. I'll give you the big fish. And then, of course, the rest of my targets will be more special teams players, niche players. You know, if they weren't comfortable with Dotson and these other guys stepping in as the primary reserves, these are the players that you would turn your attention to. But as for the big fish, how do you not mention Bobby Wagner? You know, recently released from the Seattle Seahawks. He's actually free to sign with any team right now. He turns 32 this year, and obviously, you know, he's not a player that's a long-term answer, but I still think he's probably got 2 or 3 really good seasons left in him. And Bobby Wagner has been one of the best players in the NFL for the last decade. I mean, he's an exceptional football player. And, you know, I wouldn't advocate hard because I think the contract is going to be really big for him to be signed. But if there was some type of scenario where the Bills were interested in trading Tremaine Edmunds, which I don't think there are, you know, I think that's more fan-driven than team-driven. I think the Bills are really happy with Tremaine Edmunds, and they're going to move forward with him at linebacker. But when a player like Bobby Wagner comes available, you have to at least ask yourself the question. And so as for the big fish, to me, it just had to be Bobby Wagner. I'm not expecting that, but you have to at least bring him up. As for the more reasonable options at linebacker for the Bills, how about Rashaan Evans? And I'll talk about him very much through the same lens that I just talked about Tave and Bryant. Rashaan Evans, former first-round pick of the Tennessee Titans, flashed as a rookie and then just kind of fell out of favor there, lost playing time, and obviously won't be back in Tennessee. But he's only 25 years old. He's extremely athletic. He's extremely physical. And he's an inconsistent football player, but perhaps Buffalo's the spot that can unlock his potential. And so, as I don't expect much from the Bills in the linebacker market, if they wanted to take a swing on a guy that has some upward mobility and has some good physical skill, Rashaan Evans is a player that interests me and, you know, is looking to rehab his image a little bit after failing as a first-round pick for the Titans. The next player at linebacker is Anthony Walker, 26 years old. Was with the Cleveland Browns last year, the Colts previously. He's a really good special teams player, 4-phase special teams player, and a good linebacker in coverage. Now, he's not a good run defender. I don't think you'll love him between the tackles, you know, playing downhill, taking on blocks, and defending the run. But as a pursuit style player, coverage linebacker, special teams, Anthony Walker is an appealing option. Dorian O'Daniel from the Kansas City Chiefs, very much a special teams player, a 4-phase special teamer, had a really good stretch doing that for the Kansas City Chiefs. He's a reserve linebacker that hasn't really commanded much time on defense, but if you're looking for a guy with speed and proven special teams pedigree to be a depth player, Dorian O'Daniel certainly pops. And then I'll give you another Kansas City Chiefs player, and that's Ben Niemann, who is another special teams guy, but is a player that I trust a little bit more in defense, right, to play downhill and cover. And so I know that the Chiefs have really remade their linebacker room, and O'Daniel and Niemann are on the outside looking in, but as depth players and as special teamers, I think there's a lot to be interested in when it comes to Dorian O'Daniel and Ben Niemann. So my linebacker options, the big fish, Bobby Wagner, and then you have Rashaan Evans, Anthony Walker, Dorian O'Daniel, and Ben Niemann. Let's move on to cornerback. And obviously this is a notable position of need for the Buffalo Bills with Levi Wallace, an expiring contract, Tre White coming off of an ACL tear. And, you know, the Bills need to do something here. And maybe that's a veteran and a draft pick. Maybe that's bringing back Levi Wallace in addition to a draft pick. they have options, but this is certainly a position that the Bills need to address. So as for my big fish, and I'm not sure this is a major big fish, but I'll mention Dante Jackson from the Carolina Panthers. And when I say Carolina Panthers, this is a post-McDermott player, right? This is not a player that ever played under Sean McDermott. But what's interesting to me about Dante Jackson is that, he's not the biggest corner, but he's a player that's always been his best in zone coverage, where he can keep his eyes in the backfield and use his speed to play forward and break on the football. And what's interesting about Dante Jackson is he does give you that speed element. His skill set suggests man corner, but the reality is he's best in zone. Now, if you do want to play more man coverage and you need a guy with speed to be able to run with speedy receivers on the other team, Dante Jackson has world-class speed. And that makes him very, very interesting to me. He could be expensive. I'm sure he'll have a market. He's a versatile player. He's definitely been up and down. We have to acknowledge that. He's had some issues throughout his career, but he's had plenty of high-level flashes, and he gives you a speed dynamic as a zone player that makes him really interesting to me for the Buffalo Bills. Next up is Rasul Douglas. He's entering his age 27 season, and he was actually a Pro Bowl alternate with the Green Bay Packers last year, where he had his best season of his career. Now, you don't get the athleticism with Rasul Douglas, but you do get size, you get ball skills, and you get physicality. Really good tackler, really good ball skills, does well to stay leveraged, but he's definitely got heavy feet. So this isn't a guy that you're going to want to play really at all in man coverage. But if you're going to play a lot of zone, you want tackling, you want ball skills, Rasul Douglas can give you that. The next player is the one that I hope the Bills actually sign, and that's Sidney Jones, 25 years old, former second-round pick of the Philadelphia Eagles. A lot of people thought he would be a first-round pick, but he got injured in the pre-draft process, and then he fell to the second round. And so he battled injuries over his first two seasons. He gained more playing time in 2018 and 2019 with the Eagles and started to flash. Then he signed with Jacksonville in 2020, had some positive moments, but then was traded in 2021 to the Seahawks, where his game really took off after becoming a starter in week 4 this year. So he's an excellent zone corner, excellent tackler, has the foot speed and quickness to play in man coverage. And while the Bills play mostly zone, and we've seen Sidney Jones play well in zone, he's a guy that can give you that versatility to play some man. So I love the schematic versatility, love the tackling, love the coverage ability that comes from Sidney Jones. He's a player that I hope the Bills sign, because I really think with the Bills' proven resume of developing defensive backs, that Sidney Jones could be that next guy in a lot of ways. So I'd love for the Bills to get their hands on him and see his career continue its upward trajectory, because I think he'd be a really strong answer at CB2. I'll mention Joe Hayden, 33 years old, still a fairly productive player in the NFL. You do have to be mindful that he's lost a step. And so, he's a guy that's extremely smart. He has ball skills, but he's 33. But if the Bills wanted just kind of a one-year stopgap, give yourself some insurance, can play opposite of Tre White, maybe you platoon him a little bit with Dane Jackson, I think Joe Hayden has some appeal as a bargain bin veteran. The last player that I mentioned at cornerback is Aquilo Witherspoon, 27 years old, was a draft pick of the 49ers, and he had some good moments with San Francisco. Then he went to Pittsburgh this past year and played pretty well. Long, rangy type guy, has some ball skills. You like him in zone coverage, and he has some man-to-man ability. The concern with Aquilo Witherspoon is that he's always been a below-average tackler. Even when I scouted him in college, that was an issue, and it's been problematic for him so far in the NFL as well. So he's interesting to me, but I'm not sure the tackling ability is something the Bills will want to live with. But overall, I do see some options I really like here, specifically Sidney Jones, and then Dante Jackson, Rasul Douglas, Joe Hayden, and Aquilo Witherspoon, options for the Bills at cornerback to consider. Let's move on to safety. Excuse me. At safety, this is another position just like linebacker where I don't expect the Bills to do much. They have Jordan Poyer. They have Micah Hyde. They have a couple of draft picks in Daequan Johnson, who's entering a contract year. And then, of course, Damar Hamlin, a draft pick from last year that, he dressed almost every week. So I don't know that the Bills are going to do much at safety, but if they were, I have some options. Now, I know I promised you a big fish at every position. Safety, I just don't have one. But I do have 5 reasonable options. We'll start with DeAndre Houston Carson, 29 years old. He played his college football at William and Mary. And so you can probably bet that Sean McDermott is aware of that, and that'll be something that's interesting. But as a sub-package player, specifically a matchup player in coverage, he's interesting, but also just a really good career of special teams production at this point. The next player I'll mention is Dane Krugshank, 27 years old, was with the Tennessee Titans, extremely athletic player, has been a reserve, played a bit more on defense this year, but a guy with athleticism that could play in sub and then gives you good special teams ability. Dane Krugshank is interesting. How about Dean Marlowe? That's right. He is a free agent after 1 year with the Detroit Lions. The Bills could welcome him back, and anyone that's listened to this podcast over the years knows that I've talked a lot about Dean Marlowe and his familiarity with Sean McDermott, and he's been around for a long time. There was a point in time where going into last season, Marlowe was the defensive player with the most experience with Sean McDermott because they were together since like 2014 in Carolina. And we've seen just how he can be a coach on the field. And when he did play in sub packages for the Bills, that they would, you would see him helping guys get lined up. And so, obviously Taron Johnson's the Bills slot corner, but you like what Dean Marlowe can give you as an additional slot player that can play safety, and you feel good about his familiarity with the system to play as your primary backup behind Hyde and Poyer. And so if he's ready to come back, I think that's something the Bills should definitely consider. 2 more names here. We'll go with Andrew Adams, 29 years old, from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, started his career with the Giants, but his last 4 seasons in Tampa Bay where, you saw him have to play a little bit more this year with the injuries that they had in their secondary. They had a ton of injuries, especially at safety. And he played pretty well and gives you that special teams ability as well. A veteran, if the Bills really wanted to prioritize some veteran depth and they weren't interested in Dean Marlowe, Andrew Adams is a player that has a lot of game experience that is versatile. The last name that I'll mention at safety, and I'm definitely stretching here because I don't think the Bills will be active when it comes to safeties, but I have to at least mention Terrell Edmonds, the brother of Bills linebacker Tremaine Edmunds. Terrell was a first-round pick of the Steelers, had a bumpy road with them. He started a lot of games, but the inconsistency was there, just like you saw in his tape at Virginia Tech. But he's an insane athlete. You'd love what he would give you on special teams. And again, if the Bills wanted to invest in that third safety and they weren't comfortable with Daequan Johnson and or Damar Hamlin and really wanted to challenge those players, you could see a guy like Terrell Edmonds being a consideration, especially with the ties and how McDermott has talked about Tremaine's family and support system. Well, all of that applies to Terrell Edmonds as well. So again, I'm not expecting much at safety, but DeAndre Houston Carson, Dane Krugshank, Dean Marlowe, Terrell Edmonds, and Andrew Adams are the appealing options to me for the Bills to consider. Now let's talk about punter for a second here, because the Bills have got to improve from Matt Hawk, who I've talked about on this podcast and give you a lot of metrics that tell you he's the worst punter in the NFL. And the Bills have got to upgrade it. And so there's some stud free agent punters that I'm really interested in. Brian Anger, most recently with the Dallas Cowboys. He's 33 years old, was one of the best punters in the game, and has been over the last several seasons. So I'd be interested in him. Thomas Morstead, he's an older guy, 36 years old, but he's a stud. Was with the Saints for a long time. Then he went to the Jets and Falcons last year and was a good punter still. So if the Bills were looking kind of more for a short-term option, Morstead is a player that's interesting to me. And then a young guy that's really interesting is J.K. Scott. was with the Green Bay Packers. He went to Jacksonville this past year. I think he only played in 4 games. He was injured, but his metrics in terms of hang time and touchback percentage and being able to pin people back. J.K. Scott's a young guy that has a lot of ability. So if the Bills were to go with the veteran punter, give me one of these 3 guys. I think my preference would be J.K. Scott because he's younger, then Brian Angerer, and then Thomas Morstead. But any one of these guys would represent a massive, massive upgrade to Matt Hawk. All right, folks, that's going to do it for us here today on the podcast. I went through and gave you my top 5 free agent targets, realistic free agent targets for the Bills at all of the defensive positions, and then 3 punters that I hope the Bills come away with at least one of those guys as well. So it's been fun previewing free agency over the last couple of days here. And then tomorrow is going to be our mock offseason where I am going to be Brandon Beane. And I'm going to go through everything. The players I would cut to create the cap space, the players I would sign, a mock draft, and then, of course, the 53-man roster projection. So tomorrow's show is going to be a fun one. Don't miss it. Make sure that you're subscribed. Would love it if you took a second to rate, review, and share the podcast. Have a great rest of your day, and I look forward to catching up with you again tomorrow.